The report is in, the Attorney General's summary is out, and after nearly 2 years of investigation, interviews, and indictments, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's job is officially done, and it turns out Donald Trump was right, at least in part.
There is no collusion between certainly myself and my campaign.
There was no collusion whatsoever. Where is the collusion? Find some collusion. No collusion, no collusion.
In his summary of Robert Mueller's findings, Attorney General William Barr cited Mueller's own language, quote, "The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities, but the question of obstruction is much less clear." In the summary, Barr says he and his deputy, Rod Rosenstein, quote, "have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense." But in the full report to Barr, Mueller decided not to make a prosecutorial recommendation on that issue. According to the Attorney General, Mueller wrote, "While this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him." But not one to let the truth get in the way of a victory lap. Here's what Trump said.
There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration.
Democrats want the full Mueller report to see for themselves, as several other investigations into Trump continue, including one in the Senate Intelligence Committee, 3 in the House Oversight, Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, and a campaign finance investigation in the Southern District of New York, which is still looking into Trump's role in hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. Here to help us sort it out what we do know and what we don't, Nancy Gertner, a retired federal judge and senior lecturer at Harvard Law School. Judge, it's good to see you again. Jennifer Braceras, conservative columnist and senior fellow with the Independent Women's Forum. Good to see you, too. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So, as I say, Mueller decides no collusion and conspiracy, whatever the technical term is, but he defers on obstruction of justice. Why?
He says it could go either way, is essentially what he's saying, and that the call was something that others should make. What Barr could have done is to say we need to think on it rather than do it in 48 hours. We need to discuss this. We need to talk about it. That's all, that it was a prosecutorial judgment. Mueller was unbelievably cautious in the way that everyone who knew him expected to be.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he was going to, you know, the definition of conspiracy is a very narrow definition. There has to be agreement, tacit or express. I think he was looking for direct evidence. You weren't going to find, you know, Trump on the phone saying, "Hey, yo, Putin, this is what we should do with the election." He was steering away from circumstantial evidence, my speculation, and he was going to only do that which was absolutely clear.
I want to stay on the obstruction thing for a minute. My thesis here is, since Barr realized that he was the subject of criticism for that voluntary 19-page memo he submitted as a private citizen a year ago, saying that essentially Mueller shouldn't even be looking into obstruction of justice. The president can't do it, that he would have wanted the recommendation to be made by Mueller, which leads me to conclude, just based on common sense, that if Mueller was leaning in either direction, it was to prosecute, and Barr didn't want that to happen. That's not an unreasonable conclusion, is it?
I don't think it's an unreasonable conclusion. I think with obstruction of justice, you need to be able to prove corrupt intent, and I just don't think that there's, I mean, the evidence that we have is the evidence that's on the public record. There is no other evidence that Mueller was able to come up with, and so we all know what the evidence is. He sent some ridiculous tweets, and, you know, he made some comments, and none of them, I think, in any reasonable person's viewpoint, amount to that legal standard.
Well, Mueller obviously thought in some reasonable person's viewpoint, because he's allegedly listed pros and cons. But
no, he just said there isn't.
But you mentioned corrupt intent, and in that same line in the Barr letter, he goes on to say, you need to prove corrupt intent beyond reasonable doubt, or something like that, and there was no obstructive intent. How do you decide if there's no corrupt intent when you don't interview the person who arguably had corrupt intent? How do you do that?
Well, generally in the law, intent can be proved circumstantially, and all sorts
but
of.
But why
types
wouldn't
of
you go to
cases.
the source, the person?
Because he didn't want to take on Trump with a subpoena. Although the law was clearly on the side of subpoenaing, he knew that Trump would take that to the Supreme Court, and he didn't want to delay the investigation, and he wasn't so sure what the Supreme Court would do, notwithstanding that
and
precedent.
Look, I think Trump's lawyers were absolutely right not to
absolutely.
allow him to speak to the special prosecutors because
he'd probably perjure himself.
Of course.
Right. So, do you agree with my thesis that
not because he's guilty of an underlying crime, but because the man doesn't know how to not lie?
Exactly. Either of you ever see the civil deposition we played on the show, in which he says, this is when he was Citizen Trump, and he says, the lawyer says, "Do you ever sign this the document?" And he says, "No, my son signed it." Mm-hmm. And the lawyer for the other side hands him the document and says, "Is that your signature?" He says, "Oh yeah, it is." I mean, literally. Do you agree with my thesis here that if Mueller was not leaning towards prosecution for obstruction of justice, Barr would have allowed Mueller to make the recommendation?
I agree. No, I agree. I think corrupt intent is complicated. I actually think that what Barr did is wrong as a matter of law. What he said was that if there is no conspiracy to interfere with the election, that was the only corrupt intent that could have justified the obstruction. That's not actually true. There could be, for example, I want a deep six this investigation because it's getting into my finances. I want a deep six this investigation because it's involving my son. There could be a whole host of things. Moreover, there doesn't have to be the crime. Martha Stewart famously was convicted of obstruction of justice for obstructing an insider trading investigation, but was never charged for the underlying. Right, so he has a very crabbed view of it.
One of the things I searched for this afternoon, I can't be definitive, but I found 3 former prosecutors who said they couldn't identify one case. And while the Attorney General obviously ultimately has the ultimate authority, they couldn't remember one case where the prosecuting authority did not at least make a recommendation.
Right.
Not one. Do either of you know of one? I mean, this is really, by the way, it's the same criticism that Mueller got when he was investigating the National Football League a bunch of years ago after Ray Rice punched out his then fiancée.
Well, that was different. He was a private
Yeah, it was. But the criticism of his was that he looked at things incredibly narrowly.
Right.
But don't prosecutors almost always make these recommendations?
But this is exactly the kind of recommendation that he would make. Moreover, there's something very troubling about Barr making the final call.
Because of that memo.
Because of that memo, right? I mean,
he's not a dope. Why did he do it?
Well, if Mueller is spending his time erring on the side of caution, what Barr did with respect to that finding was really just the opposite.
Do you agree with that in light of the memo? I mean, it is suspect. When you don't?
No.
Mueller's obstruction theory is fatally misconceived. That's a quote from Barr's letter of just last year. Mueller's obstruction theory is fatally misconceived.
That doesn't undermine the integrity of Mueller's own investigation and what Mueller found.
Mueller didn't make a recommendation. Barr made the recommendation.
I understand that. And you know what? He made that recommendation decision, and Congress can make a different decision with respect to obstruction.
Okay, can we, this is directed at you, because I was Googling you today to see what you said about a similar situation. The most quoted line by the Democrats, obviously, coming out of this report, is it did not conclude the president committed a crime, but he doesn't exonerate him either. The Democrats are celebrating and focusing on that. The same Democrats who excoriated somebody else in the prosecutory system a couple of years ago when he crossed the same line. Here he is.
Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information.
You criticize Comey for that. Is Mueller not to be criticized in the exact same way? If he's not prosecuting, why is he opining about not exonerating? Shouldn't he shut up?
No, here's the difference. Hillary Clinton was a private citizen at that point. This is a president, and even if it doesn't reach the standard beyond a reasonable doubt of obstruction, it raises questions with respect to impeachment and other misconduct. The president is not a private citizen. That's a whole different scene. In addition, this is hardly a president that doesn't know how to fight back. And in addition,
but that can't be the criterion for what a prosecutor does.
In addition, there have been, I'm going to the third edition, there have been instances like the Michael Brown investigation when they did not prosecute the police officer, like Jose Padilla, where they didn't prosecute Jose Padilla, and there was an explanation of why. Where there's extraordinary public interest and an election doesn't hang in the balance, it's the president for whom impeachment
but the
can cover a range of
finding
conduct.
Made clear the election did not hang in the balance.
No, I'm talking about going forward. I mean, I think that he didn't want this. Mueller felt the pressure to get this out right away, so that rather than the fall of 2019, which could conceivably affect the next election.
Let me ask you about something. I know one admission does not a criminal indictment make, but the first thing that I think many people in this country were thinking about, who are not legal experts about obstruction of justice, is this interview Trump did with Lester Holt from NBC. Here it is.
Regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
So I read a lot about this today and what a lot of prosecutors said. And the conclusion I think they're reaching, which I now agree with them, is that obstructing in plain view mitigates the criminal intent. I mean, if it had been learned that he did that in private, he said to somebody, "I'm going to can Comey,"
well, because then it would
because
seem
of the
suspicious.
Russian. So essentially, if you obstruct public, which he acknowledged doing, how is that not obstruction of justice?
Because I think again it goes to intent, and clearly this is a man who didn't think he had done anything wrong. So if he didn't think he did
didn't care that he was doing anything wrong.
No, I think he didn't think he had done anything wrong, and the facts show that he didn't with respect to election meddling.
How do you react to the whole thing?
But the issue is not whether he did anything wrong. The issue was the legitimacy of investigating monumental Russian interference in the election, multiple instances of Trump people lying, not disclosing contacts with Russians, etc.
Why did they lie, by the way, if there was no crime? Because they thought there was a crime?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that's what we have to find out.
Or they thought people were out to get them. Or because Roger Stone is a pathological liar.
Well, it was more than just Roger Stone. It was Flynn. It was Kushner not putting stuff on his security clearances. That there was a legitimacy to the underlying investigation is clear. And if Trump may be thinking he wouldn't be exonerated, but who knows what he was thinking, was trying to obstruct that is obstructing a pending investigation.
You know, I hate when hosts say, I would love to talk to you for hours, but I would love to talk to you for hours, but can't. Jennifer, thanks so much. Judge, it's good to see you.
I have nothing to say.